Welcome into another episode of the Pretend GM Fantasy Football Show. I'm Alfredo Brown, and today is finally the day we are talking league winners. I'm going to give you 17 players at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end that can help you win your fantasy football league. Let's not waste any time and let's get into it. Before I get started, I want to remind you all that the Pretend GM Fantasy Football Draft Guide is available for you over at pretendgm.com. You can click the guide section up in the top right-hand corner, and you'll see the guide available to you. All the players and more that I talk about today are going to be in that guide available for you with cheat sheets. I'm updating the guide every 3 to 4 days to make sure you guys all have the best information possible. Now, let's talk about some of these players. First guy here for me is going to be Chris Olave, wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints. He is my wide receiver 9. He is the wide receiver 11 in ADP right now, going in round 3. I've been able to get him at the end of round 2 in a lot of drafts, and that's where I like to take him, is at that turn to make sure I get my guy. Now, Chris Olave already had a massive season last year. Looking back, wide receiver 9 in fantasy points per game on the season, but when Tyler Shuck took over as quarterback towards the back end of the season, Chris Olave was the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game. That is the ceiling we know that is there for Chris Olave. He can be right up there. By the way, that only trailed Puka Nacua and Jackson Smith-Njigba. That's it. We know that Chris Olave can put up top 5 wide receiver numbers, but we're taking him as a wide receiver 11. Now, the big reason for that is, one, we've got question marks about Tyler Shuck, but we're also worried about what Jordan Tyson means for this offense. Well, Jordan Tyson has an injury right now, and that injury might linger. This is a guy who has had these injuries all throughout his college career, and Dr. Vignesh Doraiswamy talks about it in the Pretend GM Fantasy Football Draft Guide, that this is an injury that keeps coming back to Jordan Tyson, and it had him worried about Tyson going into the season. So if Tyson is set to miss an extended amount of time, or not play at 100% throughout the season, or potentially miss all of the season, which is something that's on the table if this becomes a recurring injury, Chris Olave becomes an absolute steal and a guy who could finish as a top 5 wide receiver once again. The next wide receiver I want to talk about is a player that I am drafting right after Olave, and it's Devontae Smith, wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles. He is my wide receiver 10 in fantasy football. He's got an average draft position of wide receiver 14 going in round 3. This is the other guy that I get at that turn. If I'm going Chris Olave at the 212, I'm going Devontae Smith at the 301. Looking back, Devontae Smith, 130 targets back in 2022. He finishes the wide receiver 10 overall and the wide receiver 15 in points per game that year. That was with A.J. Brown on the team. Now A.J. Brown is gone. We're talking about a massive amount of targets that could be thrown Devontae Smith's way. We look back, without A.J. Brown, 9.7 targets per game and 16.6 fantasy points per game. That is a massive output for Devontae Smith, and that's a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. But just like Olave, you're able to get him in the 3rd round, or sometimes even the 2nd round if you want to reach for the guy, which I typically like to do. He's wide receiver 14 in ADP, but he's got top 5 wide receiver upside. We always ask ourselves, who could be the next JSN? Well, it's Devontae Smith. It's a similar situation, an offense that gets a new and improved offensive coordinator, loses its top targeted wide receiver from a previous season, and an offensive line that should be much better than it was last year now with players that are healthy. Devontae Smith is a guy that can absolutely destroy his current ADP. And if you're going to start running back in your drafts, Devontae Smith becomes an easy wide receiver 1 to pick up in round 3. The other thing with Smith is that we should see some positive regression in terms of the touchdowns scored. Last year, just 4 touchdowns on 113 targets. However, we saw 18 combined touchdowns for A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert together. Dallas Goedert, who has never scored more than 5 touchdowns in a season, and A.J. Brown, who's no longer on the team. Now, that leaves everything wide open for Devontae Smith to not only have a career year, but to have a year that smashes fantasy football. The next guy I want to talk about is Malik Nabers, wide receiver for the New York Giants. He's my wide receiver 13, but ADP has him going wide receiver 12 in round 3. So how does this make sense? How can he be a league winner for me if I have him ranked lower than ADP? Well, just because I have him ranked lower than ADP doesn't mean he still can't win you your league. I'm still targeting Malik Nabers when he is there for me in round 3, because this is a guy based on previous production and talent that we would be taking in round 1 if we weren't worried about the ACL injury. And honestly, we've seen him practicing now without the non-contact jersey. He's been running around all preseason in training camp, and ADP just hasn't caught up. I would have expected his ADP to be in the 2nd round. It's not that I don't like Malik Neighbors, it's that I like some of these other guys a little bit better. But I'm willing to draft Malik Neighbors where he's going. And honestly, this is the type of pick that does win you your league, the type of pick that no one else has caught up on, where ADP is just not quite there. Now, I understand the concerns about Jackson Dart. I have my own concerns. I have my concerns about this whole offense. But Malik Neighbors is one of these guys we shouldn't be concerned about. We've seen him finish as a wide receiver one before as a rookie. We've seen him command a massive target share, even with a quarterback who wasn't playing at his best with Daniel Jones. This is a guy that, if he is healthy, and the young man should be healthy, he should be a first round pick. So to get him in round 3, that's an absolute steal. Now, a lot of these wide receivers I'm talking about are all going within the same range, rounds 2 to 4, because that's the sweet spot for wide receivers right here. Round 3 in particular, where that's where I want to get Zay Flowers when I have the opportunity. Zay Flowers is my wide receiver 14. He is the wide receiver 15 in average draft position. You can get him in round 3, but I've even been seeing him go as late as round 5. That's nuts to me, the fact that he could be the 5th best player on your team, when we've already seen him finish as a top 12 wide receiver in a very run-centric offense, even in years where Lamar Jackson hasn't been his best. But Zay Flowers has had back-to-back seasons of 1,000 and 1,200 yards. He did it in one of the NFL's lowest volume passing offense, and the target shares climbed every single year for him. He was around 29% last year in terms of target share. That was 5th amongst wide receivers. Only 4 wide receivers ahead of him, and those guys were all top 12 overall picks. So we're talking about Zay Flowers in the same sentence as guys like Jackson Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, players we're taking in the first round, no problem. Now the Baltimore Ravens get offensive coordinator Declan Doyle coming in from the Detroit Lions. He's from that Ben Johnson school of thought, and there's a good shot that we could see Zay Flowers become a sort of Amon-Ra St. Brown type of player for the Baltimore Ravens. I'm not saying he is Amon-Ra St. Brown, because when you talk about special players, these guys are one of one. But Zay Flowers is in his own right a special player who just simply has not gotten targeted. And I don't mean that he hasn't had target share, because he has. I'm talking about in an offense that just simply has not passed the ball enough. And we might see that this year. It's expected with Declan Doyle. You've got an aging Derrick Henry and a Lamar Jackson who is in the prime of his career. This offense is going to need to pass the ball. And I know they've added some weapons as rookies like Jacoby Lane, Elijah Surratt, but they also lost Isaiah Likely last year, and Zay Flowers is the focal point of this offense. This is a guy who has some positive touchdown regression coming, a high target volume incoming, and a quarterback that I'm really glad he's tied to. So I love Zay Flowers in the 3rd round. All right, this is where we start to get into more of the inherent risk that comes with some of these picks, but that's what makes them league winners. Their ADP is being suppressed a little bit lower, and we've seen that already with this guy, Emeka Egbuka. He is my wide receiver 16, but he's the wide receiver 19 in average draft position. He's going in round 4, and about a month ago, he was starting to go in round 3. Now, because of this toe injury that looks like it's just a basic turf toe, he should be fine for week 1. At least that's what the reports are. Even if he's not, we get a slow ramp up into the season. But this is the wide receiver 1 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, and Baker Mayfield, who at the beginning of last year looked like an MVP candidate until he got hurt and he got banged up. And now there's no Mike Evans there. You've got an older Chris Godwin who is going to be moving into the slot, but Ibuka's going to be playing that Z receiver position where he's going to get to move all over the offense. And that's what Zach Robinson has done really well with. Think about the offenses he's been a part of, going back to the Atlanta Falcons last year, where he was able to move Drake London all over the offense. Go back the year before, where he was able to move Puka Nacua all over the Rams offense. He has been around offenses that utilize their top wide receivers, and that's what I envision here for Ibuka in this offense. If we have a healthy Baker Mayfield and an eventually healthy Ibuka, and you're able to get him at this draft discount, and if your league is really worried, you could see him even fall later, potentially even the 5th round. I would love that on draft day for Emeka Egbuka. We go back last year, and I know a lot of it had to do with touchdowns, but he was playing like a top 12 fantasy wide receiver through the first 5 games, and then the injuries started to hit for both Baker Mayfield and Egbuka. And then we started to see a rotation at the wide receiver spot. And as the season went on, the offense for the Bucs got worse, and everything just sort of started to spiral out of control. Now we got Egbuka as the lead receiver in this offense, and it's understood this is the guy we want to target on intermediate and deep routes, but we can also use him in a variety of ways, and that's what I'm most excited for. And what makes him even more valuable to your team is that depending on your build, you could start 2 running backs in your draft, then get a wide receiver in the 3rd round, and then Ibuka as your wide receiver 2 in the 4th round. If he's able to finish as a top 12 wide receiver, you're drafting him as your wide receiver 2 in the 4th round. That's a beautiful build for fantasy football. That's what's going to help you win your league. Now, if you thought I liked these other wide receivers I've talked about a lot, this is my guy this year. If I have to put it all on someone, a player that I want in every single league, it's Luther Burden, wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. He was one of my favorite prospects coming out as a rookie. I was utterly shocked when he was not a 1st round pick, but then when he was added to the Chicago Bears and taken in by Ben Johnson, who has utilized Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jarvis Landry, I knew this was going to be the best spot for him to flourish in the NFL. Luther Burden has an average draft position of wide receiver 25 going in round 5, and that's been dropping due to his injury, his groin injury that he got here in camp. He is still my wide receiver 18, and I am trying to draft Luther Burden everywhere I can. When I see him in round 5, he is an auto draft pick for me. Looking back last year, wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game from week 12 on as a rookie. He did that in a part-time role with DJ Moore still on the field. And now DJ Moore is gone. His yards per route run landed in the 98th percentile. Luther Burden had a legitimately elite rookie season, just a small sample size. Now we get to see that in a much bigger sample size with a coach that genuinely loves him. He's been talking about him as the guy that he is going to target in this offense. He's been talking about him the same way and using the comparisons to Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jarvis Landry, guys that were fantasy football studs. That's why I love Luther Burden this year. Now, Chicago has 149 vacated targets this year with DJ Moore gone, and in a full-time role, I expect a ton of those targets to go to Luther Burden because there's also a lot of these skill set overlap between Burden and Moore. That means he can play on the outside, he can play in the slot, he can get the ball out of the backfield. There's going to be a lot of creative ways to use Luther Burden instead of just this gadget role that he was used as a rookie. And as a rookie, from week 13 on, when the games really mattered for fantasy owners in the playoffs, he was targeted on 24% of his routes. Ben Johnson wants to use Luther Burden, and I want Luther Burden on my fantasy team. The next guy I'm going to talk about here is Jameson Williams, wide receiver for the Detroit Lions. When I tell you that you can get a game-breaking, week-winning wide receiver on the projected top offense in the league, not by me, but by Vegas odds makers, and you can get that at a discounted price, I really like that. Now, looking back at what Jameson Williams has been able to do when Sam Laporta is on and off the field, I'm going to read this to you guys. With Laporta on the field, 9.4 fantasy points per game. That's wide receiver 36. So that's a wide receiver 3 floor. Without Sam Laporta, 12.8 fantasy points per game, wide receiver 13. So we're talking about a guy that when Laporta is off the field, Jameson Williams is a near wide receiver 1 with massive big playability. Sam Laporta is already dealing with 2 injuries now. He had a discectomy in this offseason that's had me a little bit worried about the lower back. Any guy over 30 can tell you lower back stuff just does not go away. And now he got another hit in camp that hurt his hip, and we don't quite know the details of it. Is it a hip bruise? Could it be something that is affecting his sciatic nerve? There's a lot that's going on there. There's a whole song about it where the backbone connects to the hip bone. Just look it up. This could mean a massive role for Jameson Williams in an offense that could now be concentrated to 3 players: Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jameson Williams. Even if Sam Laporta is back, we know that there's a good floor for Jameson Williams, a guy who's had 1,000 yards in each of the last 2 seasons. He finished as a wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game last year. And this is a guy that has just had an insane amount of talent that it's taken so long to get going. Now the role is there. Jared Goff is talking about him as a player that is night and day better each single year. It's become kind of the thing that they do, the annual tradition to talk about how much better Jameson Williams is. They don't have to do that. But Jameson Williams does seem like he is going to be a big part of this offense, and I'm excited at where I can get him in drafts. If I can get him as my wide receiver 3 in drafts, but know that he has wide receiver 1 upside, and I'm drafting him in the late 5th or early 6th round, I absolutely love that for my fantasy football build, and he's a guy that can not only win me my weeks, but he can win me my fantasy league. All right, moving on to running backs, and if you've been with me throughout the summer, you are going to hear a lot of names that you are very familiar with, and probably a lot of stats and facts that you have heard multiple times, so bear with me here, but I've got some new stuff on here for you and some players you probably have not heard me talk about just yet. But when you like these players, you talk about them a lot because you want to make sure that everyone watching or listening is drafting them. So the first running back I'm going to talk about here is Saquon Barkley, running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. He is going as the running back 8 in ADP, typically in round 2. Well, I'm taking him as the running back 6, and I'm taking him in round 1. I do not want to let Saquon Barkley fall to the 2nd round. If he does, it's once again an auto draft every single time. He's just 1 year removed from being the running back 1 overall, and he only scored 9 touchdowns last year, which is well below his career average of 13. He has done that in every season where he's had 14 or more games played. Last year, what ended up happening was that the Eagles' offensive line had injuries along the interior front. The center position and the offensive guard position, both of those guys were injured, and the goal line conversions just simply weren't there. He went 1 out of 14 on goal line carries, the absolute lowest of his career, actually 5 times lower than Saquon Barkley's career average. Every other running back with 14 plus carries at the goal line scored at least 4 touchdowns, while Saquon scored just 1. There's massive touchdown regression positively coming for Saquon Barkley. And that's also been talked about by Sean Mannion, the new offensive coordinator in Philly, who has said they passed the ball a lot under the previous offensive coordinator when they were near the goal line. That's not something that he plans on doing. We've got Jalen Hurts, we've got Saquon Barkley, we've got this top 5 offensive line, and top 5 easiest strength of schedule for running backs in fantasy football. Also, same thing for quarterback, same thing for wide receiver, same thing for tight end. The Eagles' skill players are set for a massive bounce back this year, so I'd be drafting into that offense as much as I can. But Saquon Barkley could be giving us another RB1 overall season, but he's falling to the 2nd round. I understand there's concerns about him being a little bit older, but I'm not talking about him for dynasty. I'm talking about one last ride. Make this like another Fast and Furious movie and just give me one more. That's all we need. Under Sean Mannion, with a healthy offensive line and positive touchdown regression, we could see a massive season for Saquon Barkley this year. Next running back is going to be Ken Walker, the 3rd running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. This one is a big difference between where I have him ranked at ADP. Average draft position has him as the running back 11 going in round 2. I have him as the running back 7, and I am willing to take him at that round 1-2 turn. If I'm sitting at the 12th pick and I want to make sure that I'm going running back, I'm actually willing to take Ken Walker right after Saquon Barkley. I've talked about this many times, so I'm sorry to those of you that have heard these stats over and over before, but the Chiefs plan to center this offense around Walker. He's now the 4th highest paid running back in the NFL. Kansas City desperately needed someone who could make explosive plays. Last year, they had just 1 run of 20-plus yards all season, while Walker had 10 on his own in a limited role. This is a guy who can absolutely make things happen for the Kansas City Chiefs. And also, he ranked 1st in missed tackles forced per attempt. This is a player that they know is good. They paid him like he's good, and they're going to utilize him like he's good. Andy Reid has done that so many times when he has had a workhorse back, and that's what he intends to do with Ken Walker. That's all been said, by the way, in reports and the way that they are paying him. Everything coming out of camp is that they are getting the ball to Ken Walker in space. They are hitting him with screens. They're sending him on wheel routes downfield. That's the kind of stuff that he was never really doing in Seattle, catching passes. So we're going to have a guy who has the backfield all to himself, and he's catching passes. And to be honest, he might end up being one of the top 2 target earners on this team by the end of the season. That's the kind of guy I want to buy into. That is the kind of running back I want to target in the 2nd round. And that's why I'm willing to take him a little bit earlier. Now, when Andy Reid has featured running backs like this, they've averaged roughly 1,400 total yards and 9+ touchdowns. Kareem Hunt was the last guy to get a featured role in this offense. That was back in 2018, and he averaged 21 plus opportunities per game. Now, the last time that Walker got to do that was in the brief stint during the playoffs, where he averaged 22 and a half opportunities per game for the Seattle Seahawks, and he averaged 23.4 fantasy points over that stretch. That would have been the running back one overall by at least a full point in fantasy football. So when I tell you that there is a ceiling for Ken Walker to be the best running back in fantasy football, I truly mean it. Now, I keep talking about a lot of running backs that are all going within the same area, and this one's no different. Next up in line is Chase Brown, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. He is my running back 8. ADP has him as running back 9. He is going in round 2, and this tells you all about my draft strategy this year. Get running backs in the first 2 rounds and then load up on high upside wide receivers in rounds 3 through 5. Now, with Chase Brown, he had a slow start last year, and I think a lot of people are still holding on to that. But that was without Joe Burrow. That was with Joe Flacco not on the team yet. And that was through a tough run defense schedule that he was going through for those first 5 games. By the end of the season, if anyone traded for him or even held on to him, he might have helped you win your league. Now, early in the season, he ranked only 35th in fantasy points per game. It was looking really bad. It was looking like one of the worst picks in fantasy football. Just 25th in rushing attempts, but still 7th in targets. So even when things weren't working on the ground, we now know that there's an insulation where Brown is going to catch passes out of the backfield regardless of who is at quarterback or what's going on with this offense. Things got better with Joe Flacco, and now he's still the backup there in Cincy. So we know whether Joe Burrow makes it through a full season or not, we have got a really good pass catching floor here for Chase Brown, and then the upside of scoring touchdowns in one of the league's top 5 offenses. From week 8 on last year, Chase Brown was the running back 3 in fantasy points per game. Yes, top 3 in fantasy points per game, and now he's being drafted as the running back 9. That's what I talk about when I talk about league winners, players that you're getting at a discount that have ceilings that can win you your leagues and vastly outperform where they're getting drafted. Chase Brown is another one of these running backs that can do that for you this year. The last running back I'm going to talk about is another guy, surprise, surprise, going in round 2. And it's Omarion Hampton, running back for the Los Angeles Chargers. He is my running back 9. ADP has him going as running back 10. And a little bit of that movement has happened recently because of the Ashton Jeanty injury, which, listen, first it sounded like it was an ACL. Then it turned into lower leg, which then turned into high ankle, which then turned into low ankle. And I'm sure by the time I'm done recording this episode, it's just going to be that he stubbed his toe and he'll be fine. But still, I love Omarion Hampton this year. I love the offense that he's on, and Mike McDaniel can set up a really good rushing offense for Hampton to be successful in. McDaniel has historically featured running backs in the passing game. Now, I know they added Keaton Mitchell, but we've also seen how Keaton Mitchell has been used throughout his career. He'll be in the game every once in a while, but McDaniel also knows who his workhorse back is. I know that he likes to be cheeky with the media and basically just troll whoever's asking him questions. And he'll say, we're one step closer to death. And I don't know who's going to be getting the ball. Obviously he does. There's no shot that we're going into games and he's saying, you know who really needs touches? Kamani Vidal. This offense belongs to the stars on this team. And one of those stars is Omarion Hampton in the backfield. Because of the way that McDaniel runs the offense, we're looking at a guy in Hampton who not only has the size, speed, and potential workload, he could be a guy that is catching passes and getting goal line touches in this offense. Because Keaton Mitchell's not coming in to take away the goal line touches. They don't want to use Justin Herbert on quarterback sneaks. That's not something that this offense needs to do. They want to keep him healthy. So using Omarion Hampton in a workhorse role is what's going to allow this Chargers offense to stay in games. Their defense is much improved from where it was last year or even 2 years ago. So now they can afford to slow things down. They don't have to have this fast-paced offense like they've had in Miami in previous years, and the offense is probably not going to look a lot like it did in Miami. Sure, are we going to get some outside zone running? Absolutely, and that's where Hampton has looked his best. But this is not going to be the same thing that we saw with Tua Tagovailoa, where you're trying to get the ball out really fast and running these quick scheme RPO decisions where you're just getting the ball out on screens. It's going to look very different, and that's going to push defenders away from the line of scrimmage, leaving things open for Omarion Hampton to get big chunk plays. When we talk about workload, offensive potential, offensive coordinator, and skill, Amari Hampton is a guy who could finish as a top 5 running back, and you can get him at the end of round 2. All right, let's go to the quarterback position. My first quarterback I want to talk about here is Trevor Lawrence. He is my quarterback 8. ADP has him at quarterback 9, and he's going in round 8. So that means he can be the 8th player on my team. I've already set up all my skill spots: running back, wide receiver, flex, maybe even tight end at this point. And this is where I can get a guy that can probably outkick his ADP and finish as a top 5 quarterback. That's what I'm looking for at quarterback. There's very few guys that I'm willing to take early. If I am going to go with an elite quarterback, I'm going to need him to finish well above his ADP to give me some sort of real advantage. And this is the first guy where I think I really get it. The Liam Cohen Jaguars offense could be much better than we think. And honestly, we only got to see a sample of that last year. Under Liam Cohen, Trevor Lawrence had a career high 29 passing touchdowns. In the first 8 games, as he was getting used to things, he was the quarterback 17 in fantasy points per game. And then through the final 9 games, by the way, this is when Parker Washington came on. They got Jacoby Myers onto the roster. And then Trevor Lawrence had actually been through the system and started to get used to it with Liam Cohen. He was the quarterback 1 in fantasy points per game. So we see a ceiling, a guy who can be the number 1 quarterback in this whole damn game. This is why we draft players like this. Then in the fantasy playoffs, it got even better. 33.2 fantasy points per game. He was the quarterback 1 again. Everything got unlocked because Trevor Lawrence was also willing to run the ball. He was scoring rushing touchdowns. Could some of those come down? Yeah. But the 29 passing touchdowns is not something that is this insurmountable number. That could get surpassed this year, and we could be looking at a guy who's throwing 35 or 38 touchdowns and still running for 6 or 7 touchdowns on the ground. It's not like the Jaguars defense is going to be amazing this year, and Lawrence has thrown 560 plus passes in every healthy season. The Jaguars ranked 7th in pass rate over expectation, and Lawrence had 38 end zone attempts on the ground, 6th most of any quarterback. So we see that there is a rushing floor, there's upside for an offense that's going to pass a lot, and there's a guy who has a ceiling of being the top quarterback in fantasy football in any given week, or even for a prolonged period of time. Now we give him another offseason in this offense, and what if Brian Thomas Jr. is actually good? Not like last year. We get a good BTJ, we get a good Parker Washington, and we get a good Jacoby Myers. Not to mention Brenton Strange. What if the running game can actually do something? Or worse, what if the running game can't do anything and we're really forced to pass a lot? This could be a massive breakout year for Trevor Lawrence, and you can get him in the 8th round, potentially as the quarterback 1 in fantasy football. Now, I've got a few more quarterbacks here, but this is where I start to jump all the way down into the later rounds because my preference at quarterback is to wait. That's where I think you're going to find league-winning quarterbacks, guys that you don't have to waste the opportunity cost instead of getting a good running back or a good wide receiver or any other good skill player available. You can just get all those guys early, wait for quarterback later. And this next guy I want to talk about, Tyler Shuck, is going in round 17 as the quarterback 20 in ADP. He's my quarterback 15. And I know that there's going to be a little bit of trepidation here because a lot of the excitement was that Jordan Tyson is going to be involved. And listen, at some point, Jordan Tyson could get involved. And that can only mean good things for Tyler Shuck. But even without Tyson last year, we go back to last season, Shuck was quarterback 10 in fantasy points from week 10 on. He was quarterback 6 in fantasy points from week 12 on. This is a guy that when it mattered most for fantasy managers towards the fantasy playoffs, he was not just a starting quarterback, he was a really good fantasy quarterback, top 6 in fantasy points per game as a rookie on an offense that is probably not as good as it should be this year. We got improvements along the offensive line with David Edwards being added. We've got a better running back situation with Travis Etienne back there. So that means we can have more elongated drives, sustained drives, and more trips to the red zone. That could be big for Tyler Shuck. New Orleans was even designing runs for him because he has that rushing ability. So we know there's a good floor there. New Orleans and Shuck were 4th in design rushing yards before his hip injury and 3rd in expected rushing touchdowns. Now, the passing touchdown rate was only 3.1%, meaning we could see some positive regression in terms of his passing touchdowns. And that's expected in the Kellen Moore offense that has the fastest paced offense in the NFL. When I charted him for reception perception, I was thoroughly impressed with how good Tyler Shuck is. I know that last year, prior to the NFL season, throughout the NFL draft process, he became sort of a meme, a joke for one of the throws he made at the NFL Combine that just totally whiffed. Sure, we can do that, but guys, we can't lose sight of good players who can actually play football all for the sake of a joke. We saw this guy can actually go out there, play NFL football. And when I charted him for reception perception, he was one of the best in the league at intermediate throws. Not this dink and dunk offense where he scams his way to 300 yards on screens. He was hitting passes 15, 20 yards downfield, and he was targeting his best players. That's what good quarterbacks do. And under Kellen Moore, we could see his offense get even better. So I love the potential of Tyler Shuck. And I love that I don't have to use an early pick on him, because if he can be a top 12 or top 10 quarterback and I'm getting him in round 17, I may have won my draft right there. Continuing on this trend with late round quarterbacks, and the next guy is going to be Malik Willis, quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. Now, I'm a Miami guy. I've been a Dolphins fan my whole life. This is not something I normally do. If you've been following me, you know I rarely ever talk about the Dolphins as good fantasy assets, except for Devon Achane last year or Tyreek Hill 2 years ago. But Malik Willis, this is different. This is all about the value that you can get at the quarterback spot because of his rushing ability. Now, yeah, the team could be really, really bad, but that doesn't mean that Malik Willis can't be incredibly valuable for fantasy football. Right now, he's going in round 18 as the quarterback 21, but he's my quarterback 17 in rankings. And honestly, I've flirted with putting him even higher. Now, Malik Willis has averaged nearly 7 rush attempts per start in his career. It's a small sample size, so I want to give that caveat. But there's another guy that I charted for reception perception, and I have to say, even in the small sample size, I was really impressed with how good he was. And then even in this preseason sample size for the Dolphins, he was able to execute opening drives, he was able to score touchdowns and lead the Dolphins on a 90-plus yard drive, and he had 2 rushing attempts in the first drive of the game. Now, I go back to this whole averaging nearly 7 rush attempts per start throughout his career. That would put him somewhere around 120 rushing attempts over a 17-game pace. In the last 5 years, there have been 19 quarterback seasons that hit 100-plus rushing attempts. All 19 of those quarterbacks finished top 12 in fantasy points per game at the quarterback position. Miami's already showing design runs for him in practice, and there's no other quarterback on this depth chart that threatens him to get benched. We're looking at a 17-game season sample size of Malik Willis being able to throw and run the ball all year. As long as he stays healthy, Malik Willis has serious top 10 fantasy upside at a guy that you can get as the last pick in your draft. Now, the last quarterback I'm going to talk about is a guy you all probably thought I would say a little bit earlier because he's going earlier in ADP, but it's Kyler Murray. I have him ranked as my quarterback 18. ADP has him at quarterback 17. He's being drafted in round 15. Now, the reason I have Kyler at quarterback 18 is because I do worry. Can he last the full season? Will he be the starter for the full season? Some of you are rolling your eyes at the idea that JJ McCarthy could even start games for the Vikings. But what happens if the Vikings have a losing record midway through the season? It would be relatively easy for Kevin O'Connell to say, you know what, let's go back to JJ McCarthy. Also, Kyler Murray just simply hasn't finished a lot of seasons healthy. Let's just be honest, he hasn't done it lately. He's a smaller guy who runs a lot and takes big hits. It just happens with Kyler. But while he's playing, we could be looking at a guy that is winning you weeks, and you win your season by winning weeks. That's the only reason I have Kyler Murray ranked a little bit lower. But I see the same upside with him that I saw with Willis, Shuck, or any of the other quarterbacks that have top 10 upside. We've seen Kevin O'Connell be able to turn guys that we thought were career backups into decent starters. I'm talking about guys like Nick Mullins, Carson Wentz. We thought that Carson Wentz was back. Josh Dobbs, and Sam Darnold. That's right. The Darnold renaissance happened with Kevin O'Connell. So could this happen with Kyler Murray? He's not a guy that's typically stayed on time, and that's what a Kevin O'Connell offense requires. But maybe we could be looking at a marriage, a yin and yang type of thing here that could actually work. Now, Kyler Murray's been good for fantasy football when he's been healthy and he's had good receivers. We remember when he had DeAndre Hopkins and he was consistently a top 10 option at the quarterback spot. Well, now he's got Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, an older, albeit, TJ Hawkinson, Jawan Jennings, and some running backs that aren't exactly sensational, but they can catch passes out of the backfield. And the Vikings offense has said that they are planning on changing the run scheme this year to better suit Jordan Mason. So we've got an offense that could be good, a quarterback guru at coach, and maybe we're stepping on the rake one more time here, like we did last year with JJ McCarthy. But the draft cost for Kyler Murray is so low that it doesn't hurt your team. All you're looking at with all these late round quarterbacks is upside. And that's why I'm willing to take multiples of these guys. Or you can take a guy like Kyler Murray and pair him with a Jared Goff, someone that's safe. You can take and do that with a Malik Willis, with Tyler Shuck. You can do that with any of these guys that seem a little bit riskier, but you're getting them so late in drafts that it does not matter. All right, I'm going to my last two players and I'm moving on to the tight end position. That's right, just two guys at tight end. This was a really hard one because obviously I think that Brock Bowers is phenomenal. The issue for me with Brock Bowers is that he is going so early in drafts that he not only has to be the top tight end, but he has to be one of the top 10 players in fantasy football to pay off his draft cost. Now, I love Trey McBride as well, and I think he's a fair value in drafts, but with a healthy Marvin Harrison Jr., what's the ceiling like in Arizona? Also, what happens if Jacoby Brissett doesn't get to start the full year? What happens if Jeremiah Love is catching a bunch of passes out of the backfield? A lot of the targets that happened last year for Trey McBride was because there were no other weapons, and Jacoby Brissett just went right to him. So that leads me to Colston Loveland, the guy who is ranked as tight end 3 for me. He is ADP's tight end 3, and he is going in round 4. What this does is this allows me to get a build where I can get running backs early. I can get one of those wide receivers that I really like in round 3, and then I can get the potential tight end 1 this year in Colston Loveland in round 4. Now, he didn't become a full-time player this last year until around week 8. From week 9 on, he was a tight end 2 overall. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that tight ends were injured, so maybe that number goes down a little bit. But he was also tight end 4 in fantasy points per game. And if he's doing that as a rookie towards the tail end of a season where he's still sharing more targets with guys like DJ Moore, then yeah, we might actually be drafting Colston Loveland. I don't want to say at his floor, but at a spot where we're already very comfortable doing so. Now he's going to be in a full-time role. There's a ceiling that's just higher than Tyler Warren, if I'm being honest, because of how good this offense can be under Ben Johnson. So what happens if Colston Loveland is just as good as Brock Bowers and I'm able to draft that 2 rounds later? That gives me a massive advantage in the way I've built my roster, because now I've been able to grab multiple running backs and a top wide receiver while still getting the top tight end in round 4. This is a gamble, but it's a gamble that I'm willing to take because it can win me my league. Now, in a lot of drafts, I have waited at the tight end position, and this guy is a big reason why. I thought about maybe putting Tucker Kraft here, but the way he's been talking about snaps and the way that the Packers typically handle injuries, slow playing them, I do get slightly worried. Same thing with Harold Fannin. Not that there's an injury there, but they added more weapons on offense. The quarterback situation is a mess. The offense might be really bad. And honestly, we might see 4 different quarterbacks for the Browns this year. Kyle Pitts is another guy that I think is great, and I have him ranked higher than this next player, but that's also where ADP has him. And what happens if the quarterback situation in Atlanta is also really, really bad? Not that it hasn't been that bad, but I don't think that Kyle Pitts outkicks his ADP like he's done in previous years. When I start to look at ADP, I ask myself, could George Kittle outkick tight end 9 ADP going in round 10? If he's healthy and he's back in week 1, George Kittle is a guy who has consistently been a top 3 tight end year in and year out. I have him ranked as my tight end 7. And yeah, sure, there's risk with an older guy coming off of an Achilles injury. And rarely would I ever say to trust an older player coming off an Achilles injury. But you don't really have to trust them all that much. It's round 10. Take a shot. Take a shot on a guy who can win you your league. This is creating a massive discount for us. He's already been activated from the pup. We've seen him running around looking pretty comfortable in practice. And he was tight end 3 in fantasy points per game last year. A 20% target share was 4th amongst tight ends, and his 2.3 yards per route run was also fourth amongst tight ends. 57.1 receiving yards per game was third amongst tight ends. 24.3% first read share was third amongst tight ends. This is a guy who continues to be at the top of his position regardless of age. And I know we want to make all the jokes about the electrical substation and everything that's happening over in San Francisco, but I start to look around and I say, okay, there's no Ricky Pearsall. There's maybe no Christian Kirk, depending on how that works out. Deebo Samuel has been signed to the team, but there's a lot of talk that he's actually being used as kind of a gadget player and a running back, which is kind of what he's always been. Dejon Stribling has been a lot of fun in the preseason, but we haven't seen him on the field with all the Niners stars. Mike Evans is already dealing with hamstring issues. Mike Evans, a guy who dealt with hamstring issues last year and has dealt with injuries throughout his whole career. Now we're looking at a team where George Kittle might be the top target again if he is just simply healthy. If he's not healthy, you don't lose your league because of a 10th round pick, but you can win it if he ends up being a top 3 tight end. So yes, if George Kittle is even remotely healthy and there's the expectation that he will start week 1, he is my favorite pick at tight end, especially where he's going in round 10. There you have it. My 17 fantasy football league winners this year. I hope this helps you guys crush your fantasy football drafts. And I want to remind you, I've got the Pretend GM fantasy football draft guide available for you over at pretendgm.com. You click the draft guide tab up in the top right corner. I will also have that link available for you here in the description of this episode and as the pinned comment on YouTube. So you can always just click that to make your life a little bit easier. You can always follow me over on social media, on Twitter, at Alfredo A. Brown, where I have the draft guide as my pinned tweet as well. And you can just keep up with all the stats and fun things that I'm putting out there for you guys. As always, I want to thank you all for watching or listening all the way through. Good luck in your fantasy football drafts this year. I'll see you next time. Adios.